The silence that followed the final notes of Elena Vasquez's violin was more deafening than any applause she had ever received in her 43 years of life. In that moment, before the wide-eyed gaze of the city's most demanding patrons, she realized she had spent 2 decades burying her greatest treasure beneath layers of resignation and fear. But to understand how Elena arrived at that transformative instant, one must go back 3 hours, when she was still just another invisible staff member trying to survive another day of humiliations at Le Petit Conservatoire, the most prestigious restaurant in San Francisco. The establishment buzzed with preparations for the annual benefit dinner of the city's cultural elite. Elena watched the waitstaff arrange the tables with military precision, every detail calculated to impress the guests who would pay thousands of dollars for a meal that cost less than 50 to prepare. She knew that cruel arithmetic all too well. She had worked in the kitchen for 7 years, ever since she'd arrived from Mexico with only 2 suitcases and a heart full of dreams already fogged by reality. Vasquez! The shrill voice of Marcel Dubois, the chef-owner, cut the air like a sharp blade. "Are you listening? I told you to check that every plate is flawless. Tonight I won't tolerate a single fingerprint." Elena nodded silently, lowering her gaze as she always did when Marcel raised his voice. She knew any word in response would be taken as insubordination. At 43, she had mastered the art of becoming invisible, occupying the smallest possible space in other people's world. As she polished each plate with robotic motions, her mind drifted to the sounds emerging from the main dining room. The musicians hired for the event were running through their final rehearsals. The distant echo of a violin made her heart contract with a familiar ache, a wound she had carefully kept closed so long she had almost forgotten it existed. "Vasquez!" Marcel's voice snapped her back to the present. "Stop daydreaming. The guests start arriving in an hour, and you still have half the restaurant to clean." Elena swallowed the retort on her tongue and nodded. She tucked the memory of her mother back into the secret place where she kept all precious things she could no longer touch and returned to her work. The restaurant began to fill at 7 o'clock. Elena watched through the little kitchen windows as guests arrived. Women in dresses that cost more than her annual salary. Men wearing watches that could pay her rent for 5 years. They all seemed to float in a different dimension, where problems like overdue bills, humiliating jobs, and buried dreams simply did not exist. Among the attendees, Elena recognized familiar faces from the society pages. There was Margaret Whitmore, the arts patron who funded half the city's cultural events, always with a calculated smile and an even more calculated agenda. Beside her stood Richard Steinberg, the music critic whose reviews could make or break careers, surveying everything with the bored expression of someone who had seen every possible performance. "Elena, I need you to serve champagne at the reception," Marcel said, approaching with a silver tray. The waitress assigned to that collapsed. Elena felt her stomach drop. Serving in the front of house meant exposure, being visible, vulnerable to guest stares and comments. She would 1,000 times rather hide behind the steam and noise of the kitchen. "I don't have experience with," she began to protest. "It's not a request," Marcel interrupted, in that tone that brooked no argument. "And wear this." He handed her a pristine white apron. "At least it'll help disguise your appearance." Elena felt her cheeks burn. She knew exactly what he meant. Her simple clothes, hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, calloused hands, everything about her screamed that she didn't belong in that world of crystal and silk. With trembling hands, she donned the apron and took the tray. The champagne tinkled in the glasses as she moved toward the dining room, each step a small battle against the urge to dash back to the safety of the kitchen. The guests barely noticed her as she circulated offering drinks. It was as if she were a ghost, there to serve and then vanish. Elena was used to that invisibility, but tonight something inside her rebelled against being unseen. It was when she approached Margaret Whitmore's group that everything began to unravel. "Oh, it's simply impossible to find musicians with real talent these days," Margaret was saying, gesturing with her champagne flute. "All technique, technique. Where's the passion? Where's the soul?" Richard Steinberg laughed dryly. "Soul? Margaret, you're being overly romantic. Music is mathematics, nothing more. Either you have the technical skill or you don't. Everything else is sentimentality." Elena paused in the middle of the group, feigning adjusting the glasses on her tray while she listened. Her hands started to tremble, not with nerves, but with something deeper, an indignation she hadn't felt in years. "Excuse me," Margaret said, noticing Elena for the first time. "Could you bring more champagne and maybe clear these crumbs from the table?" Elena nodded automatically, but Richard's words kept echoing in her mind. Music is mathematics, nothing more. How could he reduce something so sublime, so transformative, to mere calculation? She recalled a specific night when she was 16. She had played a Bach sonata for a small gathering of neighbors at her home. When she finished, Mrs. Carmen, a woman who worked at the same factory as her mother, approached with tears in her eyes. "My dear," she whispered, "you made me remember my daughter. She died 5 years ago, but while you played, I felt she was right here with me." Elena never forgot that moment. Music had the power to heal, to connect, to transform. It wasn't mathematics, it was pure magic. "Pardon me," a younger man's voice brought her back. He looked to be in his 30s, with tousled hair and thick-rimmed glasses. "Are you all right? You look upset." Elena looked at him, surprised. It had been so long since someone asked how she was that for a moment she didn't know what to say. "I'm fine, thank you," she murmured, beginning to move away. "Wait," he said softly. "I'm sorry, I didn't introduce myself. I'm David Chen, a reporter for the Chronicle. I'm covering the event, but honestly, I'm more interested in the people who make it happen than those who just show up to shine." Elena studied him warily. There was something genuine in his eyes, a curiosity that didn't feel condescending. "Did you hear what they were saying about music?" David continued. "About it being just technique?" "I did," Elena replied in a whisper. "And what do you think?" The question took her by surprise. It had been so long since anyone asked her opinion about anything that she almost forgot she had the right to one. I think they're wrong," she said, with more conviction than she expected. "Music it's the language of one soul speaking to another. Technique is just the tool." David smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his face. "You speak like someone who understands music deeply." Elena felt her cheeks flush. I used to play, a long time ago." "What instrument?" "Violin." The word slipped out like a sigh, weighted with all the nostalgia she had tried to bury. Just then, as if the universe conspired to challenge her further, the hired ensemble began to play on the small stage in the corner of the room. Elena recognized the piece immediately, the Bach Violin Concerto in E major, one of her favorites from youth. But as the first bars filled the air, her heart clenched. The performance was technically flawless, but utterly hollow. Every note sounded like an obligation, not a choice. It lacked everything that makes Bach divine: the intimate dialogue of voices, the delicious tension before resolution, the human breath that breathes life into the score. Elena couldn't hold back the tears welling in her eyes. They were not tears of sorrow, but of a deeper pain, the pain of seeing something you love so mistreated. "Here," David murmured, offering her a handkerchief. "What happened?" They're murdering Bach," Elena whispered, almost to herself. David followed her gaze to the musicians. "Could you do better?" The question, posed so simply, hit her like a thunderbolt. Better? It had been nearly 20 years since she had touched a real violin. Her hands were calloused from manual labor, not years of practice. They shook whenever she was nervous, and she was nervous most of the time. Yet something deep inside her, something she thought had died decades ago, stirred. A voice she hadn't heard in years whispered, "Of course you could. You never forgot. You just pretended you did." The musicians finished the first movement and paused. Elena saw one of the violinists wipe sweat from his brow with the bored expression of someone fulfilling a tedious obligation. The violin lay carelessly on a chair, treated like a lifeless object. "Do you really think I could?" Elena asked David, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," he replied honestly, "but I think you should find out." Elena looked around the room. Margaret Whitmore continued her critique of soulless music. Richard Steinberg checked his watch, clearly bored. The other guests chatted among themselves, using the music as mere background. Suddenly, Elena couldn't bear it any longer. She couldn't pretend she didn't know what was missing in that performance. She couldn't accept that her gift, the one her mother recognized so many years ago, remained buried by fear and resignation. Without thinking, Elena walked toward the stage. Her footsteps echoed louder than her quickening breath. Some guests noticed the kitchen staff approaching the musicians, but most remained absorbed in their conversations. "Excuse me," Elena said to the violinist, who looked at her with surprise and annoyance. "Sorry, you can't be here," he replied, in a tone meant for a lost child. I just I would like to play," Elena said, reaching for the violin. The violinist laughed, a harsh sound that cut the air. "You? Play? This is not a toy. It's an instrument worth more than your annual salary." Elena felt her face grow hot, but she didn't back down. "I know what a violin is, and I know how to play it." "Sure you do," the violinist sneered. "Like I know how to perform open-heart surgery because I've watched Grey's Anatomy." A small crowd gathered, drawn by the commotion. Elena saw Margaret Whitmore scowl, clearly irritated. Marcel appeared, face red with rage. "Vasquez, what on earth do you think you're doing?" he hissed, grabbing her arm. "Get back to the kitchen right now." "Wait," Margaret Whitmore's voice cut through the din. The arts patron approached with interest. "Let me see if I understand. You're saying you can play the violin?" Elena nodded, all eyes in the room turning to her. The silence that fell was heavy with expectation and skepticism. "Prove it," Margaret said simply. The violinist glanced at Margaret as if she'd lost her mind. "Margaret, you can't be serious. She's a kitchen worker." "And," Margaret replied with a challenging glint, "some of the greatest musical geniuses came from the humblest origins. Maybe that's exactly what's missing tonight, a bit of truth." Elena felt the world spin around her. Part of her wanted to flee back to the safety of the kitchen, to pretend none of this had happened. But another part, a part she thought forever lost, shouted. A voice she hadn't heard in years whispered, "Of course you could. You never forgot. You just pretended you did." The musicians finished the first movement and paused. Elena saw one of the violinists wipe sweat from his brow with the bored expression of someone fulfilling a tedious obligation. The violin lay carelessly on a chair, treated like a lifeless object. "Do you really think I could?" Elena asked David, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," he replied honestly, "but I think you should find out." Elena looked around the room. Margaret Whitmore continued her critique of soulless music. Richard Steinberg checked his watch, clearly bored. The other guests chatted among themselves, using the music as mere background. Suddenly, Elena couldn't bear it any longer. She couldn't pretend she didn't know what was missing in that performance. She couldn't accept that her gift, the one her mother recognized so many years ago, remained buried by fear and resignation. Without thinking, Elena walked toward the stage. Her footsteps echoed louder than her quickening breath. Some guests noticed the kitchen staff approaching the musicians, but most remained absorbed in their conversations. "Excuse me," Elena said to the violinist, who looked at her with surprise and annoyance. "Sorry, you can't be here," he replied, in a tone meant for a lost child. I would like to play," Elena said, reaching for the violin. The violinist laughed, a harsh sound that cut the air. "You? Play? This is not a toy. It's an instrument worth more than your annual salary." Elena felt her face grow hot, but she didn't back down. "I know what a violin is, and I know how to play it." "Sure you do," the violinist sneered. "Like I know how to perform open-heart surgery because I've watched Grey's Anatomy." A small crowd gathered, drawn by the commotion. Elena saw Margaret Whitmore scowl, clearly irritated. Marcel appeared, face red with rage. "Vasquez, what on earth do you think you're doing?" he hissed, grabbing her arm. "Get back to the kitchen right now." "Wait," Margaret Whitmore's voice cut through the din. The arts patron approached with interest. "Let me see if I understand. You're saying you can play the violin?" Elena nodded, all eyes in the room turning to her. The silence that fell was heavy with expectation and skepticism. "Prove it," Margaret said simply. The violinist glanced at Margaret as if she'd lost her mind. "Margaret, you can't be serious. She's a kitchen worker." "And," Margaret replied with a challenging glint, Some of the greatest musical geniuses came from the humblest origins. Maybe that's exactly what's missing tonight, a bit of truth. Elena felt the world spin around her. Part of her wanted to flee back to the safety of the kitchen, to pretend none of this had happened. But another part, a part she thought forever lost, shouted to seize this opportunity. "Very well," said Margaret, taking the violin from the professional musician's hands. "Show us what you've got." Elena cradled the violin with trembling hands. The first touch of the wood against her fingers was like an electric shock. She had forgotten how a violin could feel both heavy and light, as if made of solidified dreams. She placed the instrument under her chin, and for a moment all her insecurity vanished. Her posture straightened, confidence blooming. Her fingers found the strings as if they had never left them. Elena closed her eyes and let herself remember. She recalled her mother humming while cooking, the sound of rain on the tin roof of her childhood home, the first time she managed to play an entire piece without missing a note. Then she began to play. The first note emerged shaky, uncertain, but the second and then the third unlocked something magical. 2 decades of silence dissolved as mist in sunlight. Her hands remembered every movement, her fingers instinctively finding the correct positions, her heart beating in unison with the music. She played the same Bach concerto, but her interpretation was entirely different. Where the previous performance had been technical and cold, hers was warm and alive. Each note carried a story. Each pause was laden with meaning. She played as though conversing with a dear friend she hadn't seen in years. She played as though revealing secrets held for decades. She played as though finally she was being wholly honest with herself. If you're enjoying this journey of discovery and triumph, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us it's never too late to rediscover who we truly are. In the hall, a sacred silence settled. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Champagne glasses were lowered. Even the waitstaff froze, spellbound by the music filling every corner. Elena was no longer in Le Petit Conservatoire. She was back in the small living room of her Guadalajara house, playing for her mother after a long day's work. She was at her first school recital at 12, her hands so nervous they barely held the bow. She was in every moment of her life when music had been her truest language. Tears streamed down her face, but she did not stop. She couldn't stop. It was as if 2 decades of silence poured out through the strings, each note a love letter she had forgotten to send. When she reached the most challenging solo passage, her fingers flew over the strings with a precision she didn't know she still possessed. There was no conscious thought, just pure connection of heart, mind, and instrument. She improvised variations she didn't know she knew, adding ornaments that blossomed naturally from her soul. Margaret Whitmore pressed a hand to her chest, eyes wide. Richard Steinberg, the skeptical critic, leaned forward, as though witnessing the impossible. David Chen discreetly lifted his phone and began recording, knowing he was documenting something extraordinary. The silence that followed was different from any she had known. It wasn't the silence of anticipation or reverence, it was the silence of communion. For a moment, everyone in the salon was connected by the shared experience of true music. When the applause finally rose, it was different too. Not just applause of approval, but applause of recognition, of gratitude, people touched by something real. Richard Steinberg, the critic who had been so skeptical on the first night, approached her afterward with tears in his eyes. "Elena," he said, "in 30 years of reviewing, I've never heard anything like your composition. It reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place." A woman Elena didn't know, later she learned she was the director of the San Francisco Symphony, took her hands. "You must record this. The world needs to hear this music." David Chen, who had documented the entire journey, came forward with his genuine smile. "So, how does it feel to be a composer?" Elena laughed, still processing what had happened. "Honestly, I feel like I'm waking from a very long dream." "Or," David suggested, "perhaps you're finally entering the real dream." Margaret joined them with champagne and a satisfied grin. "Elena, I have a few proposals for you. But first, know that regardless of what you choose to do next, you've already done something extraordinary. You've reminded all of us, including me, that true music doesn't come from technique or training. It comes from the heart." Elena looked around at the guests still animatedly discussing the performance. Some hummed bits of her composition, others debated interpretations and meanings. Her music had sparked conversation and connection among strangers. "You know," she said to Margaret, "all these years I thought I'd missed my chance. I thought I'd let the right moment pass. And now? Now I understand there was never a right moment. There is only the moment we decide to stop waiting and start living." Margaret smiled. That's the wisdom of someone who's lived long enough to know the difference between dreaming and doing. 6 months later, Elena stood on the stage of Davies Symphony Hall in San Francisco for her first official solo concert. The auditorium was packed, over 1,000 people who'd come to hear the woman known as the musician who rose from the ashes. But Elena didn't think of herself as someone who'd been resurrected. She thought of herself as someone who had simply stopped pretending to be dead. In the audience, she spotted Sophia, who'd managed to get the night off to attend. Marcel was there too, still uneasy with his own change, but genuinely proud of the woman he'd underestimated. Margaret sat in the front row, her smile that of someone who invested in something worthwhile. David Chen covered the event for a special Sunday feature. The one person Elena most wished were there, though, was her mother. Hope had died believing her daughter had a special gift, and Elena had spent decades trying to forget that belief. Now she was honoring her mother's memory in the only way that truly mattered, by living the life she had dreamed for her daughter. Elena began the concert with the same Bach sonata she had played that first night at the restaurant. But this time, she wasn't playing to prove anything to anyone. She was playing because it was who she was, because it was what her soul needed to do, because she had finally found her way back home. When the final notes echoed through the hall and 1,000 people rose to their feet, Elena felt a peace she hadn't known in decades. She had found her place in the world, not as someone who served others, but as someone who offered her own truth as a gift to the world. That night, after all the congratulations and contracts were done, Elena returned to her apartment, now slightly larger, slightly more comfortable, but still the same place where she had rediscovered her music. She took up her violin and played one final piece before sleep. Not for an audience, not for a recording, not to prove anything. She played for herself, for her mother, for the girl she had been, and for the woman she had become. And for the first time in 20 years, Elena Vasquez fell asleep in complete peace with herself, knowing she had found her way back to who she was always meant to be.